industrial document that's times because the enduring principles in the Constitution, which I believe are divinely inspired, they survive any situation. In fact, they are meant to guide any situation. That's where the Constitution is the supreme law of the land. It says so right there in Article 6. This Constitution is the supreme law of the land. As we'll see. We're going to walk through each of the articles of the Constitution, and instead of just reading it at you, we're going to break down everything a little bit to help understand what it meant in the context of 1787, and more importantly, what it means today. And so to kick us off first, before we start on this, I'd like to bring Pastor Burton up here to lead us in the invocation.
All right. Well, let's all stand on our feet tonight for a word of prayer. Father, we just thank you so much for this night. We thank you for the opportunity to be here together to study our nation's founding document. Father, we ask you to bless our time together tonight. We just pray, Father, that you would just teach us, Lord, about our liberties and our freedoms, that, Father, we would have a deep understanding of this document that was inspired, Lord, by men that served God and heard from God, and put this document together to govern our laws and to govern our Congress and to govern the way that we ran this country. And so, Father, we just thank you for this night. We ask you to bless Shelby tonight as he brings the presentation. Just give us a heart to receive and ears to hear and understand tonight. We pray all these things in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. Thank you. Now we're going to have, please remain standing. We're going to have pledges to the American and the U.S. flag, or the American and the Texas flags. So I'd like to invite my friend Don Click up here to lead us in the pledge to the American flag.
You join me? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you very much, Don. And to lead us in the pledge to the Texas flag, I'd like to invite my good friend Tamara Collin.
Honor the Texas flag. I pledge allegiance to thee, Texas, one state, under God, one and indivisible.
Yeah! Thank you, Tamara. All right, Pastor Burton, would you like to mention our sponsors?
Thank you so much, Shelby, for allowing us to sponsor this tonight. The sponsors for this event tonight are Daniel Nation and Texas Conservatives. I have to put a disclaimer out there before every political meeting, even though this is not a political meeting, but because it is something with civil government, the IRS says it is a political meeting. Because I underwent a one-year investigation by the IRS in my church for holding meetings like this, I now have a public benefit corporation called Daniel Nation that actually allows me to go into any church in America and talk about any political candidate or issue without fear of reprisal, because I'm now a for-profit and I pay the government tax. And this is why the church can't do this, is because they're nonprofit and they don't pay tax. So the government feels that if you don't pay them tax, they should censor what you say. And that's what happened to me. I wrote about it in my book, Daniel Nation, When Christians Take a Stand Against Civil Government. I tell you my story about what I went through as a pastor standing up for the Constitution, for my rights, and I got busted by the IRS for doing it. But now I have a way to legally do what I do. So tonight, I want to ask you guys to support Daniel Nation, and a part of the proceeds that come in obviously go to pay for the church, the air conditioning, the lights in the facility. We want to be a good steward of the building and to bless the church family here. But real quickly, Daniel Nation is actually working on a project right now along with Texas Conservatives called the Capitol Ride 2025. And you got a flyer in your seat if you want to grab your flyer. And we are going back to the Texas State Capitol on January the 14th to select the next Speaker of the Texas House. And we are saying it will not be Dave Phelan. Will not be Dave Phelan if we all show up. I have recently been appointed to the Banned Democrat Chair Subcommittee for the Republican Party of Texas. I now officially serve in an official capacity with the RPT. And along with the RPT, we are fundraising to bring 7 buses to the Capitol on the 14th of January, along with other people who will drive there on their own. We want to have 1,000 people at the Capitol on the first day of the session. Because there are now 5 candidates running for the speakership, there's going to be multiple rounds of voting going on publicly on the House floor. They need to have us in the gallery with our red Bend In Chairs t-shirts on. Again, if you got your shirt, get it out of mothballs, we'll put them back on. We're going to pack out the gallery, and if you don't have one, the lady who created those has them for sale. The link is already up. You can buy your shirt. I think it's like $10. It's really cheap. So we're going to wear our red Bend In Chairs t-shirts again, and I want to bring a busload from Collin County, a busload from Denton County, a busload from Wise County and Tarrant County, and then we've got Amarillo joining us, we've got Bowie County, which is Texarkana, joining us, Tyler's coming, Houston's coming, Orange County, David Covey's campus coming from Beaumont, Port Arthur, we've got people from Waco, from Lieutenant County that are coming, so we have a huge army building. And if you click on my QR code on this flyer, it will take you to my website, which is danielnation.com. Click on bus trips, and there's a Google form I need you to fill out that lets me know that you want to ride on the bus and where you're coming from. So if you want to go on this trip, we are working to raise the funds to offset the cost of the bus. Last year, tickets were $50 a head. We're working to offset the cost by raising donations to the RPT. They've got big contacts throughout the state, so we're working on, our committee's working on raising the money to offset the buses so we can bring even more people. But go ahead and fill out the Google form. Let me know you want to come, because the bus lines are going to be based on where people live. I'm going to try to create a bus route into different counties so that we can get everybody picked up on the way to the Capitol. Does that sound like fun? Yeah. All right, well, let's support that. And another thing in your seat is a flyer that says support Daniel Nation. For any cash donation or check or credit card donation tonight that you give Daniel Nation, you will receive a free copy of my book, Daniel Nation, When Christians Take a Stand in Civil Government. This not only tells the story of the IRS persecution, but it also tells the story of how we took 600 people to the Capitol last year, and we were able to get 17 pro-conservative bills passed in the Texas legislature with Dave Phelan, the Democrat, running it, and 7 of those protected Texas kids from sexualization. It was a phenomenal year. We're going to go next year, and we're going to close the Texas primary, get the Democrats to stop voting in the Republican primary. We're going to work on the border. We're going to work on very important issues that have to do with things that the RPT voted on at the state convention in May, which I was there with 9,000 delegates. We're going to work to champion those issues, and the only way to get those passed is if we get a true Republican speaker like a Dr. Tom Oliverson or a Shelley Slauson, or even some of these others are pretty decent, but if we get a true Republican speaker to not put Democrat chairs on the committees, we can actually get the RPT legislative priorities passed in the session, not on May the 31st when the session is closing, but on March the 31st when the session is really underway. And not push our legislation to the back of the line and pass all the Democrat legislation. But the way that works is we've got to select a better speaker, and that happens when we all show up together. So if you fill out that card tonight, we're going to, Rito and Bob, if you guys will get the offering baskets ready, they're going to just pass the baskets down the aisle tonight, and you can give cash, you can give a check, make it out to Daniel Nation, or if you want to give on credit cards, just fill out that slip right there that says support Daniel Nation with your credit card information. If you don't feel comfortable putting your credit card info on the slip, then on danielnation.com, you can just go click on donate on the website. You can give straight to the website if you want to do that. And then on your way out tonight, my books are on my table, at the information table, out in the lobby. Just pick up a free book. I'll sign it if you want me to. On the way out tonight. And then also don't forget to go see the Texas Conservatives table. We're doing a Zoom call on Tuesday night, September 24th at 7 p.m. I believe. And we're going to be talking about mobilizing for the legislative session on the Zoom call with Texas Conservatives on the 24th, which is a week from tonight. So go see their table as well, okay? All right, you guys can go ahead and just pass the baskets down the aisle and receive the offering. And with that, Mr. Shelby, I'm going to turn it back over to you, and I'm going to get your slides pulled up, and here's your clicker for tonight.
Thank you so much. There we go. All right, this is Constitution 101, an introduction to America's founding documents. We're actually only going to touch briefly on the Declaration of Independence. That set the stage. Do we have any elected officials or candidates in the room? Okay, skip this part. This is me. If you can scan that QR code from where you are, that'll get you to my website. Or if you like, I've got business cards out on the table, out in the lobby. You're welcome to take one. And that's my contact information. It's on the business card as well, obviously. So, the Constitution was created after over a decade of the Articles of Confederation. After the American colonists declared independence, vis-a-vis the Declaration of Independence, they drafted the Articles of Confederation. In short order, even after the war was won, the Revolutionary War, they saw that the Articles of Confederation had issues. It was creating problems in these 13 independent but interlinked colonies functioning as a new fledgling nation. And so several delegates from a handful of states came together at the Annapolis Convention. They discussed the issues with the Articles of Confederation, and they said, you know what, we need representatives from all of the states to come together to, quote, render the Constitution of the federal government adequate to the exigencies of the Union, end quote. That's fancy speak for saying, do what we gotta do to make this work. And that's what they did. The delegates from the Annapolis Convention called the Constitutional Convention that we are familiar with in Philadelphia, that brought representatives from all the states. The preamble to the Constitution that starts with "we the people" is important because it lays out the reason for the Constitution, the purpose for the document, which they spent almost 4 months cloistered in a hot room in Philadelphia. Granted, Philadelphia ain't Dallas, but still. No AC back then. They cloistered themselves in a hot room. A lot of them didn't get along. You know, it wasn't all kumbaya in there. And they did a lot of arguing day after day as they drafted this phenomenal document, which is the oldest document in the world that is still active to provide a framework for self-governance. It has endured for 237 years. The principles therein, like I said earlier, are timeless. They apply at all times to all people. The preamble is, "We the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union." That doesn't mean they thought they were perfect, but we want to be even more perfect. Like, hold my beer, I'm going to take perfection to a new level. It's that they recognize we were never going to be perfect, but we should always strive toward perfection, never attain it. In order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare. The word welfare in 1787 didn't mean what it means today. It meant well-being. Promote the general well-being, create an environment in which well-being is promoted and attainable and encouraged, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, our youngins. We do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. It starts with the words "we the people" for a reason. It's a compact amongst not just 13 colonies, but the people of the 13 colonies, because they recognized critically that people are flawed, we're fallen, we're sinners, and we fail. And governments are just people. That's it. Every government is flawed, fallen, sins, and fails, because it's just people. Thomas Aquinas said, if men were angels, there would be no need for government. Well, we're not, so there is. Without governance without government, we have anarchy by default. So we get good government or bad government. This document, the Constitution, was constructed in such a thoughtful way as to recognize that however good the intentions are of the people in government, they're still human. And so the entire document was meant to stymie and hinder the worst elements of human nature. Gridlock was kind of built into the system. You know, when we hear that so-and-so is going to get things done in Washington, getting things done is Washington parlance for sticking it to the American people. Because the more they get things done, the worse things usually end up, because the government's all people. So the system of checks and balances, the very simple version of which we learn in school, is meant to promote gridlock. It's meant to do as little damage as possible, or allow the humans involved in government to do as little damage as possible. Now, back in 1787, it was hard, even when it was just 13 states, it was hard to actually get to the Capitol in Washington from your home district in order to represent the people. So they weren't there all the time like they are today. The Texas legislature, by our Constitution, you know, they have a while looking at Congress. By our Constitution, we only meet for 5 months every 2 years to limit the amount of damage, you know, that the legislature can do. Unlike Congress, where they never leave. Made more difficult by the fact that, you know, we've got jets. So this entire basis is to recognize that it's just a bunch of humans in the government, and they will tend toward bad over time. So it's creating a system to try to promote the best in the humans and mitigate the worst. Because it doesn't matter, they could have thought everybody at the Constitutional Convention and everybody who might be a governor or a member of Congress or president at the time was a pristine human being. None of them were going to live forever. So the system had to survive all of them and had to account for the worst that humanity might offer up in the future. Which brings us to today. These are both the Constitution. The one on top is this one, as written, including the amendments, and this even includes the Declaration of Independence. It's very simple, it's easy to read. It takes a little work to understand the kind of antiquated English of the day, 237 years ago, but it's meant to be understood by the layperson. That's kind of the point. It doesn't require 9 oracles in black robes to tell us what it says. However, that monstrous tome underneath the Constitution in my pocket, we call Conan, Constitution Annotated. That is the Constitution that new legislators in Washington receive. It's thunked on their desks and said, here's the Constitution. Like, what is this beast? What is this monstrosity? That is the Constitution, the little version, as interpreted by more than 2 centuries of Supreme Court jurisprudence. All the Supreme Court decisions that affect what we're supposed to imagine the Constitution says. And again, it's meant to be accessible to the layperson. We don't need the Supreme Court to figure out what it says. The reason the Supreme Court ever gets involved is because when it comes to all those humans in the legislature passing laws, they sometimes muddy things up and make things difficult to understand. And that's been exacerbated over time and maybe accelerated by the Chevron doctrine. So this was a 4-decade-old Supreme Court decision that said where there is ambiguity in a law passed by the legislature, then the courts should defer to the regulatory agencies, the unelected bureaucrats, to figure out the details. Well, this presented a great opportunity for the people in Congress. We can write all this mealy-mouthed legislation that doesn't actually figure anything out or say anything. We can take credit for passing the Save the Children Act and then leave it up to the ever-increasing executive branch to figure out for us. And then the courts, which are supposed to be a counterbalance to this, apply the Chevron doctrine and say, well, we're not going to figure it out. Leave it to the unelected bureaucrats. That has given increasing incentive to Congress to not actually address any of the issues facing our nation in the form of legislation, or at least create legislation that purports to fix our issues, but just creates more. Again, humans involved. So very recently, the Supreme Court decision this year overturned the Chevron doctrine and said, kicking it over to the regulatory agencies is an abrogation of the responsibility of the judiciary. If our job as the justice system, the judiciary, is to interpret the law, then we need to do our job. And by the way, it wouldn't hurt for the legislature to do their job and actually fill in the blanks in the laws that they're writing. But that makes it harder to get reelected. Bueller? Okay, well, I already read the preamble, but there it is. Oh, no, I'm sorry, that's not the preamble, my bad. This is from the Declaration of Independence. So, most of the Declaration of Independence is actually listing out the grievances against England and why we were declaring independence. But it laid out a few core principles. One of these is right here. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, most people are familiar with those words. Most people recognize those. The next bit, but that's where most people stop knowing. The next bit is every bit as important. And that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. Right there in the Declaration of Independence, it doesn't repeat it in the Constitution, but in the Declaration of Independence, it lays out the whole purpose for government, to secure our rights. And it's important to understand, especially when we get into the Bill of Rights, that our rights don't come from government. They come from the Almighty. The laws of nature and nature's God, as spelled out in the Declaration. Government cannot grant you rights. It can only take them away or recognize them. That's it. That's all government can do, because government is just humans. But it's this understanding and this recognition of the purpose for government that led to the structure of the Constitution that we wound up with. Okay, so these are the three branches of the federal government. This is what we see in school. We've got the legislative branch, the executive, and the judicial. In that order, by the way. The first article, Article 1, is the legislature, not the executive, the presidency. And on purpose, because the legislature is closest to the people. But the legislature, the Congress, people think of the House of Representatives as the Congress. The Congress is actually both the Senate and the House of Representatives. So Article 1, yes ma'am. I know, it's shocking. So Article 1, the Congress, all legislative powers, means not executive orders, herein granted shall be vested in a Congress of the United States, which shall consist of a Senate and a House of Representatives. So we're going to go through a few slides about Article 1, the makeup of the legislature, the powers granted to the legislature, the powers prohibited to Congress. So this is congressional appointment. The House of Representatives are elected for 2-year terms directly by the people. The number is based on population. All free persons, excluding Indians not taxed, and 3/5 of all other persons. We're going to go into a sidebar here. This is the infamous 3/5 compromise. So you may have heard in 2020 and thereafter that the founding fathers only considered black people, slaves, mostly slaves, in the South, all slaves at the time, to be worth only 3/5 of a person. That's a complete misreading of historical reality. The argument in the Constitutional Convention was about congressional apportionment, because the number of seats in the House of Representatives was based on population. Well, the southern states, which were protecting the institution of slavery at the time, even in the Constitutional Convention, they had a large slave population. The southern slaveholding states wanted each and every one of them to count in the census to increase the number of representatives that the southern states had in Congress, in the House of Representatives. Because the abolitionist movement was already well underway in 1787. And this was a big source of contention and argument in the Constitutional Convention and among the states at the time, and in the ratification conventions. So the 3/5 compromise was the deal struck between the abolitionists, who wanted slaves to not count at all because they weren't free. They didn't have the rights of anybody else. So they wanted the slaveholding states to not be able to count slaves toward the number of congressional representatives that those states would have. And it was the slaveholding states who wanted them to count as full people for purposes of congressional apportionment and having more power in Congress to protect the institution of slavery. So that's like turning the current modern narrative completely on its head. It was the slaveholders who wanted slaves to count as full people. So, in the decades-long pursuit of the abolition of slavery, at that moment in time, in 1787, 3/5 is almost an exact measure in the United States of pro versus anti-slavery sentiment. That's how 3/5 was arrived at. If 90% of people were in favor of abolition, that compromise wouldn't have been in there. It never would have been necessary. The pro-slavery proponents would have been steamrolled in the Constitutional Convention, and we never would have fought the Civil War. At least not over slavery. There were other causes to the Civil War, but that was a big one. Now, so sidebar over. The Senate, when our country was formed, we did not vote on our senators. Senators, not until the 17th Amendment. The Senate was selected by each state legislature. Now, the reason for this was important, because the states were sovereign entities. New York, Maryland, Virginia, etc., they were their own sovereign entities. They weren't just auxiliary arms of the federal government. And in fact, the big argument between the proponents of the Constitution and the opponents of the Constitution were between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. The Federalists championed a stronger central government. That was the federal government. Federalism means a centralized networking entity with individual, we think federal today as just a gigantic megalithic federal government, but it literally means the form of a republic with a centralized hub, if you will, of the independent or semi-independent states. And those states were supposed to have a check and power over the federal government, the Senate. So they would, the purpose of this was for the state legislatures to select who is going to represent their state, the 2 senators from their state, 2 from Texas, 2 from Maryland. Well, Texas wasn't a state then, but you get the idea. We have 2 senators from every state in the U.S. Congress. They were meant to be chosen by the state legislators so that the states as entities themselves would have a check over what happened in Congress. When the 17th Amendment was passed, which we'll go into more detail in later, that turned the relationship between the states and the federal government on its head. The states no longer had that power when senators became directly elected by us, which we're going to have an election this year in November for our senator. And there were 2 senators per state, obviously, as today, regardless of the population of that state. There are states with more senators than House members. Alaska's one. Okay, so these are the powers of Congress. This is what Congress is charged with. These are the powers that they have. The financial, regulatory, protective, legislative, and then there are specific powers forbidden to Congress. We're going to get into each one. The financial powers are to lay and collect taxes and tariffs. I know that's an unpopular one, but having government instead of anarchy comes with a certain level of overhead, so it's necessary. To borrow money and to coin money. These are the powers of Congress, financial powers. The regulatory powers are to regulate commerce with foreign nations and native tribes and among the states. Next sidebar discussion. The power to regulate commerce among the states essentially meant that North Carolina couldn't slap a tariff on the sale of goods from South Carolina between the states. However, in 1945, a landmark Supreme Court case, Wickard v. Filburn, held that a farmer in Ohio, this was under crop quotas, this was a time of crop quotas, where the federal government was saying, you can't grow more than X amount of crops because we're trying to control price levels. Because that always works out well, right? So a court held that a farmer in Ohio who was growing crops, like extra crops, for the consumption of his own animals. He wasn't selling the extra crops. He was just growing extra crops and his animals were eating those crops. He was violating the crop quotas because he was withholding those crops from the open market. Essentially, if he wasn't growing those extra crops for his own animals to eat, then he would have been purchasing crops on the open market for his animals to eat. Thereby, he was affecting commerce under the Interstate Commerce Clause. That's what that is. The power to regulate commerce among the states. An appeals court threw that out. They said, that's nonsense. That's not what the Commerce Clause means. But then the Supreme Court said, no, that sounds good to us. And they ruled that because he was affecting commerce, that fell under the regulatory powers of Congress, under the power to regulate commerce among the states. I want you to rack your brains real hard and think of anything you do that does not affect commerce in some way, directly or indirectly. The time I set my alarm clock for in the morning affects commerce based on how productive I'm going to be that day. Everything affects commerce under this read. This Supreme Court decision of Wickard v. Filburn, more than anything else, opened the floodgates to federal government regulation, which has not slowed. So, establish laws on naturalization, citizenship, and bankruptcies, provide for the punishment of counterfeiters, establish post offices and roads. Tiny sidebar, post offices are not mandated under the Constitution. They are only permitted. I personally think in 2024, the need for a federally run postal service has long since expired. This could easily be handled by the private sector and far more efficiently. So Congress is not required to operate a post office. It is only authorized under the Constitution to operate a post office. Patents, kind of important, create courts inferior to the Supreme Court. So the Supreme Court can't create its own lesser courts. That's another important check and balance. That's up to Congress. These are protective powers of Congress. So to provide for the common defense and general well-being. I said well-being here. The word in the Constitution is welfare, but again, it means well-being. So providing for the common defense. The president is the commander-in-chief of the armed forces. It's Congress's responsibility to create the military structure. Another check and balance, separation of powers. Organize, arm, discipline the militia, and call forth the militia. So militia these days has a bad connotation. Militia back in the day quite literally meant the able-bodied men of a town. And we didn't have a standing army then. So if there was a threat, then, young men trained in, shooting, fighting, etc. And if there was a threat, if there was a need, then the militia, meaning the able-bodied men of a town, were called forth. And Congress was given the power to organize, arm, and discipline the militia, and to call them forth at need. Make rules for the government and regulation of the land and naval forces, again, military. Raise and support armies. Again, these were meant to be temporary things. We're going to raise an army for a limited time use, a limited time purpose. Provide and maintain a navy. Declare war. This is important. We have not actually declared war, I think, in any of our lifetimes. We keep fighting, we keep, going to war, but Congress has not actually declared war, I think, in any of our lifetimes. World War II. I think probably everybody in here was born after World War II. War was declared in World War II. Define and punish felonies on the high seas, pirates are, and offenses against the law of nations, and make rules concerning captures. These are all wartime things. The legislative powers of Congress. Here's an interesting one. Make all laws necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers. This is called the necessary and proper clause. So this gives explicitly Congress the ability to create the regulatory structure and the laws to support all of the powers they've just been given under the Constitution. So this says you can draft any laws you need, create any regulatory structure you need in order to provide for the military, structuring it, doing all the other stuff, coining money, establishing the mints, all of that. Now, these are specific powers that are forbidden Congress. It's like, notwithstanding anything we just told you you can do, you absolutely, positively cannot do these things. First, deny any state the right to admit migrants or immigrants until 1808. So they post-dated that, said, okay, we're forming a new country here, new structure, new constitution and everything. We're ditching the Articles of Confederation, and Congress cannot shut off the tap to immigrants until 1808 at the earliest. Suspend habeas corpus except in times of rebellion or invasion. Pass a bill of attainder. That's declaration of guilt by a legislative body. That's like, the court says so-and-so's innocent, and the legislature says, no, we're going to turn the screws. We're going to pass a law declaring so-and-so guilty. Can't do that. No head or direct tax. That's like, you're a person, $20. $20 fine for being a person. Or draw from the treasury without an appropriation bill. You actually have to draw an appropriation bill to say the money you want, what it's for, that has to pass the body in order to draw money from the treasury. So that's the legislature, Senate and House of Representatives. Now we're going to cover the presidency, the executive branch. So this is Article 2. Each branch of government has its own article under the Constitution. Article 2, the executive power to execute, literally, not like, but to make happen, shall be vested in a president of the United States of America. So presidents are appointed in a fairly convoluted way. This is the Electoral College. So elected by presidential electors from each state. The number of electors is equal to the number of senators and representatives for the U.S. House in that state. And no senator or representative can also be an elector. And the president serves for a 4-year term. Now, what's important to note about this is, like I said, they got together, our founders, our framers, for almost 4 months in that hot room in Philadelphia. They closed the shutters so that people couldn't snoop, see in, hear what was going on. It was conducted kind of in secrecy. They didn't stream it on YouTube like we're doing tonight. And it was hot in there, and they were dressed to the nines in wool, They were eager to be done and get out of there. The electoral college system, which some people say needs to be dispensed with, 100% disagree. Our framers did not come up with that electoral college system because they had nothing better to do on a Sunday afternoon. They spent a long time on it, trying to carefully think through the checks and the balances, the contingencies. How would the states maintain their sovereignty or pseudo-sovereignty? And how would the people and the states as entities have a true say in the highest office in the land? That's why the Electoral College is so important. And again, it wasn't done idly. They didn't just think, you know what, let's make this as complex as possible. Just because. It would have been a lot easier for them to say, just have everybody vote. Let's just call it a day. Our framers, our founders, feared a pure democracy. That's just like everybody votes on everything. They feared a pure democracy, which was gaining ground intellectually in the day, almost as much as they feared a monarchy, which is what they just declared independence from and fought a war against. Now, I'm going to get to what I was about to say a little later. So these are the powers of the President of the United States. So we spent a lot of time looking at the powers of Congress, including forbidden powers. This is the President. The Commander-in-Chief of the troops called into actual service of the U.S. Again, that's Congress's job. If the Congress needs to raise an army or call forth the militia, it's for a purpose. And then the President is to be Commander-in-Chief of, and that's the words in the Constitution, the actual service. Make treaties. President has unilateral power to make treaties with other countries. Nominate ambassadors, public ministers, and consuls, federal judges, and other officers established by law with, and you've heard this term, the advice and consent of the Senate. So presidents can only nominate these people. They have to be voted on and confirmed by the Senate. But remember what the Senate was. The Senate was essentially the federal arm of the state legislatures. And fill up vacancies during a Senate recess. So when the Senate's recessed, they don't just have to leave these positions in limbo if there's a need. The president can make a unilateral appointment at that time, but that person then has to be confirmed when the Senate's in session. And again, they didn't have jets to just fly to Washington and have a vote. Power of reprieve and pardon, and the veto power. Congress makes a law that the president doesn't think is a good idea. The president can say, nah, we're not doing that. Of course, Congress can override that with a supermajority vote, but still, the president gets to say, nah, we ain't doing that. Wait a second. Presidential powers. No, that's it. There's only one slide of presidential powers. If you blinked, you missed it. This is all the president was ever meant to do under our Constitution. Yes, ma'am. They're not there at all. Yeah, they can ostensibly do them. Okay, so she asked, where are the executive orders? They're not in the Constitution. Executive orders, when they first started, were really just basically instructions to the executive branch on how to conduct the executive branch's business as permitted by the laws that Congress passed. Over time, however, presidents discovered that they had a pen and a phone, and the legislature had already abrogated its responsibility via not just the Chevron doctrine, but other avenues to say, yeah, that's going to hurt my reelection chances, so I'm just going to write this feel-good bill that doesn't actually do anything, and we'll let the president figure out how to do it. When Congress has already given up most of its actual power, it doesn't fight too hard for the power that it just gave up. That's when presidents can step in with executive orders and say, I think we're going to do this now. And a weak-kneed Congress or weak-kneed judiciary isn't really inclined to step in and say, nah, you don't get to do that. Or even if they do, certain presidents are like, all right, let's see you enforce it. And that's where we get current executive orders. Now, it is worth noting that when President Trump assumed office in 2017, after he was elected president, he issued a lot of executive orders. Most of them, overwhelmingly, were reversing the prior administration's executive orders. It was undoing it. But, like I said, that's it. That's all the president was meant to do. And I love the way Ben Shapiro puts this. Constitutionally, he wants the president to be like the plumber. Make it work. Just make it work efficiently. And the plumber is the kind of person where if everything's fine, you don't even think of the plumber. Only when bad stuff is happening do you think of the plumber. The president was meant to be a singular person, other than the vice president, that is not tied to any state or any representative, any one state or district or anything. And he was just meant to be the person who made everything work, made the plumbing work. But that's why there's just one slide with the powers of the president. Does anybody believe this is all presidents are limited to these days? Not by a long shot, man. But that brings us to Article 3, the third branch of government, and deliberately the final one. Our framers listed these in order of their importance. The Supreme Court was never meant to have the power that it does today, just like the president was never meant to have the power that the president has today. But the judicial power of the United States shall be vested in one Supreme Court and in such inferior courts as the Congress may from time to time ordain and establish. Again, Congress gets to decide that, not the court, not the president. So, SCOTUS appointments, Supreme Court of the United States, again, nominated by the president and confirmed with the advice and consent of the Senate. They serve a life term, maybe a life sentence, depending on your perspective. So the judicial powers for the Supreme Court, Article 3. All cases in law and equity arising under the Constitution, the laws and treaties of the U.S. made under their authority. So this is not under the state constitutions. A matter of state law that does not touch on the Constitution or the federal laws doesn't come to the Supreme Court. All cases of admiralty and maritime jurisdiction, controversies to which the U.S., the government of the United States, is a party, like if I wanted to sue the federal government, or better yet, if Ken Paxton or Greg Abbott before him wants to sue the federal government, then that goes to the Supreme Court. Controversies between two or more states or citizens of different states. So if I've got a beef with somebody in Oklahoma, that's the Supreme Court. If it's not something that happened particularly in a state under a state law, that's the Supreme Court. Or if it's Texas versus Oklahoma, that's the Supreme Court. And controversies between citizens and a foreign nation. So if North Korea doesn't like that I'm giving this seminar, then that would be heard by the Supreme Court, which hopefully wouldn't extradite me to North Korea. So the jurisdiction. In all cases affecting ambassadors, public ministers and consuls, and states, Supreme Court has original jurisdiction. That means it starts and ends in the Supreme Court. In all other cases, Supreme Court has appellate jurisdiction. That means it starts elsewhere and can be appealed to the Supreme Court. But for cases affecting ambassadors, public ministers, consuls, and states, it starts with the Supreme Court. So when Ken Paxton and 20 some odd other state attorney generals filed a suit at the end of 2020 after the 2020 election because of all the state laws and constitutions that were subverted to just unilaterally change election laws in 2020 ostensibly because of COVID, that was filed directly with the Supreme Court because it was the states who were filing. So that didn't start out in another court and then go to appeal. It started and ended in the Supreme Court.
If that was the case, why did the Supreme Court say that those states had no standing?
Yeah, It started with the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court that said they didn't have standing. So standing is the legal principle that somebody has to be directly affected in order to bring suit. So like, I can't file a lawsuit that, Pastor Burden got ripped off with a bad pair of shoes. I don't have standing there. That's not my problem, it's his. It's up to him to file suit against, I guess, the shoe manufacturer, whatever. I don't have standing. So when General Paxton and the other states brought this suit challenging, it wasn't the election results. So let's go back to electors for a moment. There's a principle that's in the Constitution. It doesn't say it like this. It doesn't even say it nicely, but it's a principle that our founders wanted people to have a local throat to choke. So, members of the House of Representatives, I know my congressman. I know my House of Representatives. He's elected locally. It's a big district, but still fairly local. Our senators, they're not accessible, but they were meant to be put into the U.S. Senate by our state legislators. And I have personal relationships with my state legislators, my state senator and my House rep. It's a local throat to choke. They're elected locally. The electors, we think we go vote for president in November. We don't. We are not voting for president. We are voting for the slate of electors, presidential electors, of which each state has the number of their members of the House of Representatives and the Senate, that are selected much earlier in the year. I know my presidential elector. It's a local throat to choke. I voted for my presidential elector in that process. So those electors, depending on the state you're in, they cast their ballots when the presidential electors convene in December after the November election, usually according to how the vote for president went in their state, but we don't actually vote for president. Part of the reason for this, especially back in 1787, is we could go meet our candidates for state legislator, for House of Representatives, mayor, to a lesser degree governor. We could go meet them, we could talk to them, we could form our opinions of them. People running for president were not accessible even then. They're not making, especially then without jets and buses, they're not making a campaign stop everywhere across the country. But our electors, I can vote for my elector and I can say, I trust you. I trust your judgment to pick somebody who will serve this country well as president. You're my local throat to choke. I'm not going to choke you, don't worry. That was that principle. And that's why we have the Electoral College that we do, so that we could choose our electors, because people in 1787 didn't have the access to information or the wherewithal or the ability to get to know the presidential candidates well, and that was an elector's job, is to be up to speed on this and to make a wise vote. So, that sidebar, the ability for people to make a wise choice hadn't really improved over the centuries, but the electors meet in December after the November election. So that's what happened after 2020. In 2020, through COVID and everything, numerous states just unilaterally changed their own state constitutions, violated their own constitutions and their own state election laws in order to, protect from COVID or whatever. But there was no authority to do so under the law. They just did it and said, what you gonna do about it? Pennsylvania was probably the most egregious, but by no means the only culprit, when the Pennsylvania Supreme Court just gave a thumbs up to all the violations of Pennsylvania election law and then said, well, you don't even have to postmark a mail-in ballot. We'll take whatever, whenever. And just count anything that shows up. In a scenario like that, it's impossible to even prove fraud. You've just erased the ability to do an audit. Lock, stock, and barrel. And there's just no way to actually confirm the results, let alone the integrity of an election. And that's what the suit that Ken Paxton and the other states was about, that they brought to the Supreme Court. They said all of these states, subverted their own constitutions. They subverted their own election laws and just, to a greater or lesser degree, depending on the state, said, hey, it's a free-for-all, just do whatever you want. And that affects us. With the only office in the entire country that is an amalgamation of multiple states. Every single other office is state-specific. And so that's what that lawsuit was about, to basically throw out the electoral college votes of the states that had subverted their own constitutions. Because the subversion of the Constitution in Pennsylvania affects us because we're still all trying to pick a president. The Supreme Court, there was going to be precedent one way or the other with this suit. This was an unprecedented suit, and so there was going to be precedent. There was going to be standing or no standing. The Supreme Court ruled that the states did not have standing. I ardently disagree. Under Article 3, the states have standing. Nobody else could possibly have standing in such a matter. And if the states as entities don't have standing, I as Shelby don't have standing, nobody has standing. So the precedent that was set is, well, states, you just got to suck it up. If Pennsylvania or Ohio or Florida or any other state is going to conduct their elections and cast their electoral college votes in such a way that pollutes your ability to have a fair vote for president and vice president, too bad, so sad. But that established that precedent, and so it's going to take another Supreme Court and another challenge to say, no, that was a bad decision. The states now have standing. By the way, this is another thing lost in the modern narrative. All the hubbub about January 6th, 2021, was about the congressional vote to confirm and accept the Electoral College vote. That's Congress's responsibility, is to confirm the Electoral College vote. The Electoral College actually meets in each state individually. The electors from Texas meet in Austin. The electors from Florida meet in Tallahassee, etc. And then they transmit the results of those Electoral College votes to Congress. Congress counts them in a joint session, House and Senate, and certifies them. So on January 6, 2021, that's what everybody was doing at the Capitol. They were there for that vote. And a lot of legislators, Senate and House, Ted Cruz was one of these, was advocating basically what Ken Paxton and the other states were bringing to the Supreme Court and got shut down. They were saying, let's not count the electoral college votes from states that violated their own laws. Biden might have ended up president that way. I didn't do the math. I don't know if anybody did. I haven't heard about it. But that was the point they were making, because those states unquestionably violated their own laws and constitutions. Like, there's no arguing that. And so that's what the January 6th vote was all about, and that's what the split in the Senate and the House of Representatives was about, is about whether or not to count the electoral college votes from the states that willfully violated their own constitutions. And it was different in each of those states. Sometimes it was the Supreme Court of that state that said, yeah, we're just going to throw out the laws. Sometimes the governor just did it unilaterally. Sometimes the Secretary of State did it unilaterally, and nobody mounted a successful challenge, or everybody else gave it the thumbs up. But that's what January 6th was about. And it was that vote to confirm the electoral college votes that brought everybody to the Capitol on January 6th. And as a side note, this was immediately scrubbed from social media and the internet in general on January 6th. And people aired the clip of President Trump saying, you got to fight like hell, over and over and over. And scrubbed from the national consciousness were his words, "We're now going to walk over to the Capitol and peacefully and patriotically make our voices heard." Can't find that clip, except on X now. But that's where the long-winded way of answering the question of standing. So there were two of the conservative thinkers I admire most, Mark Levin and Ben Shapiro. They were on opposite sides of that issue with the Supreme Court and with January 6th. They were on complete opposite sides. And I understood the rationale for both, and it was a tough situation. And God willing, we'll never be in a situation again where states are just throwing their own constitutions and laws out the window for whatever reason. Because as we're going to see in the Constitution, there is no circumstance, zero circumstances in which the Constitution can be put aside. Not for safety, not for nothing. The Constitution is the supreme law of the land, and it is meant to govern and guide under all circumstances. So, moving to Article 4, States and Citizenship. Full faith and credit shall be given in each state to the public acts, records, and judicial proceedings of every other state. That means that my Texas driver's license has to be recognized in Oklahoma. Yes, ma'am?
I'm sorry, just to go back real quick in regards to electors. How can we find out who our state electors are? And like, when do they need to meet? What do they do? You know, what do they do?
I believe they're on the Secretary of State website, but they're elected, in Texas at least, every state's a little different. In Texas, they're elected in the state conventions, respectively for the Democrat and Republican parties. And it depends on whom the popular vote winner is from the state, which slate of electors gets chosen. That's why I say when we go vote in November, we're actually voting for that slate of electors. So if we go to the polls in Texas and President Trump is elected with the popular vote in Texas, then the slate of Republican electors that was elected at the Republican State Convention in May will be our presidential electors. If we go to the polls and Kamala Harris gets the popular vote for president in Texas, then the slate of electors from the Democrat convention will become the electors in Texas. Yep. So there is an exception to this. Full faith and credit shall be given in each state to the public acts, records, and judicial proceedings of every other state. So public acts as a nuance, like I said, my Texas driver's license is honored in Oklahoma. My Texas license to carry a firearm is not necessarily honored in other states. And in Texas, as of the 2021 legislative session, we don't even need a license to carry anymore. I still renew my license to carry for reciprocity with other states that require a license. We have, it's not really constitutional carry, it's unlicensed carry in Texas as of 2021, but that's an exception to this rule. Article 5. This is how the Constitution gets changed. Now, I'm going to go ahead and read it. The Congress, whenever 2/3 of both houses shall deem it necessary, shall propose amendments to this Constitution, or on the application of the legislatures of 2/3 of the states, shall call a convention for proposing amendments, which, in either case, shall be valid to all intents and purposes as part of this Constitution when ratified by the legislatures of 3/4 of the several states, or by conventions in 3/4 thereof, as the one or the other mode of ratification may be proposed by the Congress. There's going to be a quiz on that later, so make sure you got it memorized. I'm going to unpack this. So, through the Constitutional Convention, they recognize that the Constitution may have to change periodically. So there should be a mechanism for this. One of the challenges to the Articles of Confederation, which the U.S. Constitution replaced, was that the ability to amend it was really super duper hard and pretty impossible. So we got to these two branches of Congress, the Senate and the House of Representatives. So they said, whenever 2/3 of both of these folks agree on something, all right, then you've got a proposed amendment, an official proposed amendment. But then it actually has to be ratified by the states. The states get a say, not just Congress amending the Constitution by itself. Congress can propose this, the states cannot. Congress can propose it, the states get to give it a thumbs up or a thumbs down. Congress got to choose whether it was 3/4 of the legislatures of the states or conventions in 3/4 of the states. So the Constitution itself was ratified by conventions in each state, not by the existing state legislatures. It wasn't the New York Assembly that got together and gave the thumbs up to the Constitution. People were represented at the convention in New York for determining whether New York was going to ratify the U.S. Constitution. Now, 2 days before the culmination of the Constitutional Convention, so today is the anniversary of the finalization of the Constitutional Convention, September 17th. 2 days prior, September 15th, Colonel George Mason, an anti-federalist and delegate from Virginia, he got up and, paraphrasing Madison's notes, basically said, so, we're going to leave this to Congress to amend the Constitution. Are we to believe that if the federal government becomes corrupt, which he believed it would, that they're going to propose the sorts of amendments necessary to rein themselves in? How's that work? And again, according to Madison's notes, everybody was like, oh yeah. So they started discussing an alternate method of amending the Constitution. And so that's why this man, Colonel George Mason, is considered the father of Article 5. Because after some debate and a few systems were proposed, they arrived at this alternate method of proposing amendments to the Constitution, which is if 2/3 of the states, however many states there are at a given point of time, if 2/3 of them say, we need a convention to propose this amendment or to talk about this issue and propose amendments, then the states get to end run Congress and say, we're going to do this ourselves. Congress can still, like whatever amendments might come out of the convention, this has never happened, by the way. The convention has never happened. I'm a big proponent of it. I got involved politically for the first time with Convention of States, which is an organization devoted to pursuing this. Because if you haven't noticed, Congress doesn't actually propose amendments anymore. They used to. Over 11,000 amendments have been proposed in our country's history. Only 27 of them have made the final cut. And 2 of those, prohibition and the reversal of prohibition, were just backed each other out. We got the first 10 all at once in the Bill of Rights. So my friend Tamara Colbert over here, she kind of got me involved and yes, brought me along in the Article 5 movement. But this is the alternate method. It's to say that we can't trust the federal government to get this done. So we, the states, are going to exercise our power to do it as well. This provision, this alternate provision for proposing amendments to the Constitution was adopted unanimously in the Constitutional Convention. And either way, as it says, whether it's Congress, 2/3 of each branch of Congress proposing something, chamber I should say, not branch, or 2/3 of the states having a convention to propose amendments, they still got to go out to the 3/4 of the states for ratification. So, as I noted, the federal government doesn't propose amendments anymore. They just do stuff. Nobody holds them accountable. Or they kick it over to the executive, and the executive does stuff, and nobody holds them accountable. This was meant to provide a mechanism for the states to do what the federal government would not. Article 6, supremacy. This Constitution and the laws of the United States, which shall be made in pursuance thereof. Important clause. It's not just this Constitution and any laws that Congress thinks are a good idea. It's only the laws that are made in pursuance of the Constitution. The laws that are made authorized by the Constitution. And all treaties made, or which shall be made under the authority of the United States, which is the president, the executive, shall be the supreme law of the land. That's where this document is so remarkable. it says that the document, the codification of these principles themselves are superordinate to any person, state, time, principle, whatever. And that's why it took them so long when they all just wanted to go home. The supreme law of the land. And the judges in every state shall be bound thereby, anything in the Constitution or laws of the state to the contrary notwithstanding. The senators and representatives before mentioned, and the members of the several state legislators, and all executive and judicial officers, both of the United States and of the several states, shall be bound by oath or affirmation to support this Constitution. I take that oath. Whenever I'm sworn in, I've been elected twice to Plano City Council, I took the oath to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States and of Texas. And I meant every word of it. But no religious test shall ever be required as a qualification to any office or public trust under the United States. Another important sidebar. No religious test shall be applied to the United States. That is the federal government. As we're going to see as well when we get to the First Amendment, it says, Congress shall make no law. It specified Congress. The states, many of which had a religious test. And a lot of the religious tensions amongst Protestants, Catholics in the early United States were found in Independence Hall itself during the Constitutional Convention. That's one of the reasons that they didn't all get along very well. You had Protestants, Catholics, Quakers, Lutherans, all under one roof. And back in the day, that was the main thing people argued about. And so under various state constitutions, there are religious tests. This applies overarchingly to the federal government. Article 7, ratification. The ratification of the conventions of 9 states shall be sufficient for the establishment of this Constitution between the states so ratifying. So there were 13 states at the time under the Articles of Confederation. They determined at the Constitutional Convention that if only 9 of them said, we want to do this, then then the Constitution would be adopted, and those 9 states would be part of the new United States. Any state that did not sign on could do its own thing. They could join together with the other states that didn't sign on. They could be totally independent, whatever. Ultimately, it was unanimously ratified. But in each of those conventions, so it called for the conventions in each state. All the delegates came in the convention and they bickered and argued and ultimately chose to ratify. But the Federalist Papers, those are the better known publications championing adoption of this Constitution, were published at odds with the Anti-Federalist Papers, the lesser known Anti-Federalist Papers. So the Anti-Federalists, folks like Colonel Mason, the aforementioned, were concerned that under the Constitution, the federal government had too much power. And they wanted more protections for people's rights. So during these conventions, the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, they wanted more protections, and the Federalists ultimately said, all right, I understand what you're saying. If you adopt this Constitution, then when the new Congress convenes, we'll introduce a Bill of Rights. We'll amend the Constitution to provide for all of these things that weren't provided for in the Constitutional Convention. Ultimately, enough of the Anti-Federalists said, okay, but I'm keeping you to your word. I want that Bill of Rights. So, Constitution was adopted, the new Congress convened. James Madison, who's considered the father of the Constitution, he was one of the members of the House of Representatives in the new Congress. And the very first Congress did what every Congress since has done, which is sit on its hands. And the Anti-Federalists were like, hey, where's my Bill of Rights? You said, yeah, we'll get to it. Don't bug me about it. And Madison was championing this within Congress. This is where we got our very first initiative for that second mode of amendment under Article 5. Congress wasn't doing it, at least not fast enough, so the states said, you know what? We got this second provision in Article 5, we're going to do it ourselves. We don't need you. So they started passing applications for a convention under Article 5. The states said, okay, we'll have our own convention, we'll propose the Bill of Rights, we don't need you. And then Congress, feeling its power was already starting to ebb, said, all right, we got it. We'll go ahead and do it. So they introduced 12 amendments, 10 of which were ratified. An additional amendment was ratified like 200 years later. Took a while. The 12th was never ratified. The one that was finally ratified 200 years later just essentially said that, Congress can't vote itself a pay raise in the middle of a session. You got to go through an election first before you get your pay raise. I don't know why that took 200 years. Jeez. But the 10 of the 12 that were ratified became what we know as the Bill of Rights. Speaking of which, so we're going to go through each of the Bill of Rights and then select other amendments. So, the First Amendment, most of us are familiar with a couple of tenets of this. This is the one we're going to unpack the most. A lot of people aren't familiar with all the tenets of this. So first, as I alluded to earlier, it says, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, nor prohibiting the free exercise thereof, nor abridging the freedom of the speech or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. So first, respecting an establishment of religion. There are a lot of people that think the Constitution says that there is to be separation between church and state. That is nowhere to be found in the Constitution. That was written in a letter by Thomas Jefferson to the Danbury Baptist Association almost 30 years after the Constitution was written, assuring the Danbury Baptist Association that there was a wall of separation between church and state. This does not mean that nobody in the government can be religious. Consider the time. We just fought a war of independence with England. One of the big issues was that the Church of England was the state church. It was the official church of the government of England. So much so that to this day, 2024, clergy from the church, upper clergy in the Church of England have an automatic seat in the House of Lords, which is the British Parliament's equivalent of the Senate. That's the extent to which the church in England, the Church of England, had a foothold in the government. So the First Amendment was never meant to keep the church out of government. It was meant to keep the government out of church. Just look at Daniel Nation. That was its purpose. It says respecting an establishment of religion, establishing a religion, a government-sanctioned religion. Guess what happens when there's a government-sanctioned religion? All the others seem to mysteriously fall by the wayside. Okay, so respecting an establishment of a religion, nor prohibiting the free exercise thereof. This was a big deal in 2020 when churches were shut down. And by the way, the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances, that was a big issue as well. So all kinds of First Amendment violations in 2020. But as I say, freedom of religion was the original promise of America before there ever was an America. People came to America, have come to America for centuries, before we ever had an American government, before the British colonies were even really established, overwhelmingly for religious freedom. There are lots of other opportunities, but mainly for religious freedom, which there wasn't a lot of back in Europe. That was the original promise of America. And that's why it's the very first clause of the very First Amendment. This was very much in the minds of the first Congress, our framers, our founders. So freedom of speech in the press, everybody's familiar with that. That didn't require a lot of discussion. Second Amendment. There's a little bit to unpack here. A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. There's a big difference. This is also the shortest amendment. Short, sweet, to the point. There's a big difference between the Second Amendment and the First Amendment. The First Amendment says Congress shall make no law. It applied to Congress. This says shall not be infringed, period. Now again, let's take a step back. We just fought a war from an oppressive England. And the militia, the able-bodied men of a town, were the soldiers in that war. So we prevent the able-bodied men, or women for that matter, from learning to defend themselves, from learning discipline, learning how to use weapons at our own peril. Something happened in Australia a couple of decades ago. Australia had a mandatory gun buyback. That's really gun confiscation, but they throw a few Australian dollars your way. Took away everybody's guns. In 2020, under the pandemic, Australia, of all places, was one of the most repressive countries on earth. Guess what would not have happened in Australia in 2020 if they had not had the mandatory gun confiscation a couple decades prior? Because despite Joe Biden saying the Second Amendment doesn't matter because these days you need a tank and an F-15 in order to take on the military, that was proven to be not true just a few years back by Clive Bundy, who had I think it was almost 2-month standoff with the Bureau of Land Management, of all departments, the armed Bureau of Land Management, over ranching rights. Clive Bundy and a bunch of supporters came and had a 2-month standoff with just regular long guns. No tanks, no F-16s, not even any automatic weapons. Because the reality is that anybody will think twice when looking down the business end of a firearm. Anybody. Now, except maybe the Joker. He's like, whew. But that's why we have the Second Amendment. It was not meant to hunt deer. It was meant as a check against the worst tendencies of humans when they get a hold of a little bit of power. So, another side note, well-regulated, that term, it does not mean regulated by the government. Back in the day, 237 years ago, well-regulated, you can find this in historical texts, meant in good working order, competently functioning. A competently functioning militia, competently functioning able-bodied men of a town, being necessary to the security of a free state, not just from external threats, but internal. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. So, we talk about what constitutes reasonable, what do we consider arms in a reasonable way these days? In short, what it meant then, which was not muskets, it was whatever the government had. That's what that meant in the context of the day, is whatever the government had access to. And back in the day, any good bell founder could retool his shop and make a cannon. You know? That was the artillery of the day, and it was accessible. And the Second Amendment protected cannons. A little harder to bear, than a sidearm, but still, it protected cannons. So it meant whatever the government had, or could have. Okay, moving on to the Third Amendment, quartering of soldiers. This isn't such a big deal anymore, but it's there for a reason. No soldier shall in time of peace be quartered in any house without the consent of the owner, nor in a time of war, but in a manner to be prescribed by law. So if you're in an actual state of war, as declared by Congress, by the way, then Congress can make a law to determine how soldiers can take over somebody's home for quartering, which happened in the Civil War. But that's why that amendment's there. Fourth Amendment, search and seizure. The right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated. Shall not be violated. And no warrants shall issue but upon probable cause, which an actual case has to be made. And probable cause isn't, that guy looks kind of shifty. Supported by oath or affirmation, and particularly describing the place to be searched and the persons or things to be seized. That last section means no wild goose chases. Well, we think so-and-so is probably up to no good, so we want a warrant to go see what we can find. No fishing expeditions. You have to describe what you're looking for, because if you actually have probable cause, then you know why you have probable cause. This is never violated today, is it? Of course not, no. Fifth Amendment, due process. No person shall be held to answer for a capital or otherwise infamous crime unless on presentiment or indictment of a grand jury, we're all familiar with that concept, except in cases arising in the land or naval forces, military tribunals, or in the militia, same principle, when in actual service in time of war or public danger. Nor shall any person be subject for the same offense to be twice put in jeopardy of life or limb. Here's a nuance here. This is talking about criminal law, double jeopardy. You should not be put twice in jeopardy of life or limb. That means your freedom, not your cash. O.J. Simpson was famously acquitted on the criminal charges, but then he had to go through a whole new trial. That was the civil trial for monetary damages. He was never in danger of being sent to prison in the civil trial. He was just in danger of losing a lot of money, which he did. Nor shall be compelled in any criminal case to be a witness against himself. So if I'm on trial for something, the government, the prosecutor, nobody can make me testify against myself. I can keep my trap shut. That's where we hear in all of the Law and Order episodes, counsel has advised me to not speak or to exercise my Fifth Amendment right on the grounds that it may tend to incriminate me. That's the Fifth Amendment. Pleading the Fifth means I'm not going to tell you anything about me or where I was on the night in question or anything like that. Nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation. Now, this is eminent domain. This is abused in a lot of parts of the country. But if private property is to be taken for public use, then you have to fairly compensate the person you're taking the land from, or the property. It doesn't say land, property. You have to fairly compensate the person you're taking the property from. Sixth Amendment, trial rights. You'll notice that out of the 10 amendments in the Bill of Rights, most of them have to do with the judicial system and criminal justice. Now again, the Constitution codifies the rule of law. And I'm going to share a little sidebar that I found fascinating. So my fellow council member, Maria Tu, she was born in Taiwan. She's a lawyer. And when we first really talked, after we were both elected the same year, she told me that she became a lawyer, born and raised partially in Taiwan, because she saw the culture in Taiwan. I mean, Taiwan is China. It's Chinese culture. Chiang Kai-shek and a bunch of people fled the channel into Taiwan after the Maoist revolution in China, or during the Maoist revolution. But it's still China. They have a culture that's thousands of years old. And she noted when she came to America that our culture, unlike many parts of the world, our culture is the law. And she brought up another point, which I thought was fascinating. She said, in America, overwhelmingly, if somebody comes to a stop sign in the middle of the night, nobody around for miles, they'll still stop. Or at least come to a rolling stop before they move on. We don't even think about it. That's just a fundamental inherent respect for the law. In other countries, they'll just cruise right through without a second thought. And so it's this, and as is encapsulated through much of the Bill of Rights, this attention to law and the rule of law and the judicial system that really speaks to the cultural roots we have as Americans in the rule of law. So all criminal prosecutors or prosecutions, the accused shall enjoy the right to a speedy and public trial by an impartial jury of the state and district where the crime shall have been committed. So if I run a red light in the middle of the night when nobody's around in Oklahoma, then I'm standing trial for that in Oklahoma. But I won't. I'll stop at it like everybody else here. Be informed of the nature and cause of the accusation. So I have a right to be told why I'm being tried. And it can't be, you know why you're being tried. That was pretty common in the Soviet pogroms. To be confronted with the witnesses against him. So you can't have an anonymous person saying anonymous things for which I'm going to be tried. I have the right, if I'm on trial, to have the witnesses who claim they saw or know what I did to stand there in front of me and look me in the eye and say, yeah, he ran that red light. I was there. To have compulsory process for obtaining witnesses in my favor. So I have to have a process to say, no, I stopped, and I have people who can prove it. You have to let me call them. And to have the assistance of counsel. I have to be able to have a lawyer. If I cannot afford one, then one will be appointed for me by the court. That's constitutionally protected. And again, this says in all criminal prosecutions, not in all criminal prosecutions under the laws of the United States. This is all criminal prosecutions, full stop. Just like the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed, full stop. Seventh Amendment, right to trial by jury in suits at common law where the value and controversy shall exceed $20. The right of the trial, inflation's kicked in a little bit since then, especially in the past few years. The right of trial by jury shall be preserved, and no fact tried by a jury shall be otherwise re-examined in any court of the United States other than according to the rules of the common law. So if a fact concerning me, we have video that you ran that red light, like you only slowed like 5 miles an hour and then you just kept going. If that's examined and then said, yeah, 5 miles is kind of cool, whatever, just let it go, then that shall not be re-examined by another court. Eighth Amendment, cruel and unusual punishment. I feel like definitions on this have changed a little bit over the past couple hundred years. Excessive bail shall not be required, nor excessive fines imposed, nor cruel and unusual punishments inflicted. So I did see kind of a funny meme a few years back. It said, the problem with the world today is that nobody drinks from the skulls of their enemies anymore. That would probably constitute cruel and unusual punishment, and we might live in a very different country if people actually drank from the skulls of their enemies. But that is prohibited by the Eighth Amendment. Ninth Amendment, enumeration of rights. This and the next are very important. The enumeration in the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage other rights retained by the people. This means that just because we didn't spell out a right in here does not mean that right does not exist. And the 10th Amendment. The powers not delegated to the United States, the federal government, by this Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. Quite simply, this means state sovereignty. This means that if the Constitution does not prohibit a right by the state, and it does not explicitly grant that right to the federal government has no rights, no powers that are not spelled out in this Constitution. There are no implied powers. There are express powers. If the Constitution does not say the federal government can do it, then the federal government can't do it. And that right, that power falls to the states or to the people. We've forgotten that as a country. We're going to skip ahead to the 13th Amendment. This is the abolition of slavery. We had to go forward a few decades for this to happen. But, so interestingly, we talked about the 3/5 compromise. the abolitionist movement was gaining ground the whole while. England was the first, slavery was just widespread throughout human history. The tale of human history is pretty much one long tale of us killing and enslaving each other. It's pretty rosy. England was the first country to abolish slavery in the abolitionist movement, which was really spurred by Enlightenment thinkers. And the United States was the second. And we fought a great big war over it. And then the amendment, which was actually codified into the Constitution, abolishing slavery. This is different from the Emancipation Proclamation. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime, whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States. Shall not exist, nor any place subject to their jurisdiction, the United States jurisdiction, territories, etc. Congress shall have the power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. Wipes out the concept of slavery or involuntary servitude, other than through, punishment for a crime and due conviction. By the way, just as a side note, it was Republicans who passed this. 15th Amendment, voting rights by race. Skip a couple ahead. The rights of, so slavery was wiped out, but many former slaves and black people, predominantly in southern areas, still didn't have the right to vote. However, in many northern states, free black people did have the right to vote right after this Constitution, and many of them did. So the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. The Congress shall have the power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. So this ensures everybody has the right to vote, at least based on race. We'd have to skip ahead a little bit to make sure women have the right to vote. But first, we took a little detour with an income tax. Yeah, everybody boo. Boo, income tax. And the 17th. The Congress shall have the power to lay and collect taxes on incomes. It did not have the power previously under Article 1. This is on incomes, from whatever source derived, without apportionment among the several states and without regard to any census or enumeration. 17th Amendment, direct election of senators. There was a big groundswell of public sentiment in the country before this was ushered in to say that we should have the right to vote directly for our senators. By this point, to the extent that they had ever known, people had forgotten about the very deliberate balance of power between the states and the federal government. They were thinking about the balance of power between the branches of the federal government and forgotten all about the states. It passed. So now we directly elect our senators, and the states come begging as paupers to the federal government, instead of vice versa, which was the way it was meant to be 237 years ago. Now we get to the 19th Amendment, women's suffrage. Yes, and many of you voted for me, so thank you. Thanks to the 19th Amendment. The right of citizens to the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. Questions? You have a question, ma'am? Okay, so she said none of the laws pertaining to voting ever said that they had to be a citizen. That's correct. And those laws are citizenship. They're not codified in the Constitution, except that it gives Congress under Article 1 the ability to establish laws regarding naturalization, which extends to the right to vote. And then also there are various states with a raft of laws governing voting rights. So it doesn't spell it out in the Constitution. Of course, at the inception of the Constitution and on its ratification, the concept of citizenship, we hadn't even established the laws regarding citizenship yet.
Can you address, I think you mentioned in May, of course, we had the Convention of States supporters and the opponents. Can you address the fear of actually having a Convention of States with New York and California in that convention, trying to amend our Constitution? And do you feel that we would, with the three-fourths majority needed to ratify
Okay, so I'm paraphrasing the question. Can I speak to so there was a big debate in the Republican State Convention between proponents of Article 5 in the Convention of States, like me, and opponents who are concerned that by its very nature, if a convention is called, it's going to represent all states. All states have a seat at the table, not just the states that call for the convention. And with states out there that are driving people to Texas and Florida, like California and Washington and New York, if they have a seat at the table, what's to prevent the bad amendments? What's to prevent them from basically usurping the convention to introduce a lot of stuff we don't want in the Constitution? And secondary to that, with the 3/4 ratification threshold, 3/4 of the states have to ratify. Is that a high enough bar to prevent anything bad from happening? So a couple of nuances here. First, the applications, the resolutions for a convention that are sent to the federal government, they have to be for the same subject matter. The proof of this is in the fact that over 700 applications for an Article 5 Convention of the States have been submitted in our nation's history. I think we don't have 700 states yet, let alone 700 being 2/3 of the states. But we have never had 2/3 of the same subject matter. Now, the applications don't have to be for a specific amendment. You don't have to have a fully baked amendment. Some applications are for fully baked amendments. The balanced budget amendment people have a fully baked amendment. They want a balanced budget amendment. The Convention of States organization, which myself and Tamara are part of, has it topically. It's to limit the power and jurisdiction of the federal government, impose fiscal restraints on the federal government, and limit the terms of office for federal officials and members of Congress. In other words, limit the federal government's time, money, and power. So 2/3 of the states have not yet passed that resolution for that subject matter. So technically speaking, when that occurs, then the federal government will be obligated, shall call a convention. It's not left to their goodwill. Then the convention would have to be called. The federal government gets to choose the time and the place. They might choose Mars in the year 3827, but they get to choose the time and the place of the convention. And then the states get to choose who their delegates are. But under the entire convention history in the United States, even before there was a United States, the principle of one state, one vote has always applied. So California can send the entire population of California to the convention. It's going to get real crowded, but California only still gets one vote. Just as each state had one vote at the Constitutional Convention. And not every state had the same number of delegates. Now, the reality is that should we get the convention, there are significant barriers toward any amendment, not just bad amendments, any amendment passing. Case in point, like I said earlier, over 11,000 amendments have been proposed in our nation's history. That doesn't mean Congress voted 2/3 on 11,000 amendments, but only 27 of them have made the final cut. So the ability to amend the Constitution is incredibly hard, deliberately so. And the ratification by 3/4 of the states means that all it takes is, if Congress chooses the method of conventions for ratification, all it takes is 13 states to say no. Conventions in just 13 states to say, nah, we don't want to do that. To torpedo anything, good or bad, torpedo anything at all. And if Congress chooses ratification by 3/4 of state legislatures, that means that just one chamber in each of 13 states can nix an amendment. So realistically, and they call the concept a runaway convention. You know, convention delegates get together and they just start proposing really wild stuff, and they say, we want to completely change the Constitution, we want to get rid of the Second Amendment, you know, we want to codify this, codify that, and just make it unrecognizable. Well, it's still got to be ratified. And I have no fear of a runaway convention because the barriers and the bars to actually accomplishing anything are so high that, including ratification itself, that what I actually fear isn't a runaway convention, it's a do-nothing convention. I'm afraid that we're going to get the convention finally, which which precipitated the Bill of Rights. It was the threat of the convention. And what I think is going to happen as we get closer to that 2/3 threshold, Congress is going to step in and propose a bunch of watered down amendments to placate people, and the convention won't happen. Or if it does, people are going to be bickering and arguing for 4 months, 4 years, however long it lasts, and never agree on a single thing, and nothing's going to happen. Or if it does, and a fantastic array of amendments come out, they don't get ratified. And here's the biggest threat. Or if they do, best amendments that we could conceive come out of it. They all get ratified. If we as Americans don't change the way collectively that we approach government, everything we gained is going to be stripped away from us inside a decade. Because those who seek to oppress and restrict the power of the people have had over a century of practice at this. And if we, the people, don't change how we approach government, we're going to get rolled, no matter what comes out of a convention. But the overarching point here is, even if you feared a runaway convention, even if you feared all these amendments, it doesn't matter anyway. With all the articles I went through tonight, all the amendments I went through, does anybody think any of that is properly adhered to anymore? Any of it. I'm not worried about a runaway convention because we already have a runaway federal government. Yeah. So, yes, ma'am.
Talking about the military being president, so he did not have the right to say you can get out of the LG, whatever. He did not have the right to make that statement. He also didn't have the right to tell them not to take the vaccine.
Well, she said that the president, as commander-in-chief, didn't have the right to force service members to take a vaccine. The Constitution's silent on that. That falls under law. The commander-in-chief, the president, is the commander-in-chief of the armed forces. To the extent that the branches of the military are created by Congress, the Army is called forth, war is declared, which hasn't happened for many decades. The president, within all those confines and within the laws duly passed by Congress, has the authority to govern the military as he sees fit. That's not prohibited under the Constitution. Now, there are other laws in place which protect this right or that right, like the ability to decline a vaccine, for instance. That's where a lot of the service members who were fired for refusing to take the vaccine and dishonorably discharged, their cases are coming back in court, and the courts are saying, that should not have happened. You should not have been discharged. The government did not have the right to force you to get vaccinated. But that's not under the Constitution. That's under various laws passed under the Constitution. Yes, sir. If it were a living document, if our founders meant for it to be a living document, there would be no need for Article 5. They wouldn't have built in a way to change it if they felt it should just change with the times. They knew times would change. They knew the world would evolve. They had watched the world evolve, much slower than we're watching it, but still. They knew times would change, and they were creating a document that they hoped would survive for centuries, that would be applied for centuries, as long as this fledgling country could survive. And so that's why they built in that Article 5 process to amend the Constitution, recognizing that people living in times that they couldn't even conceive in 1787 might see a need to change it. And so they provided that mechanism. Not just creative reinterpretation based on the conditions of the world at any given point in time, but by going through the diligent process, which, by the way, is a process that can be applied at any point in time, wisely. And, but by the same token, they deliberately made it very difficult to do so. So if you were going to fast forward 200 years, and if it really needed to change, then that high bar shouldn't present such a problem. If everybody thinks this is a great idea, given the world of 200 years in the future, which could also be 200 years in the future from today, if everybody then thinks that a certain change is such a great idea, then it should sail through without a problem. But if not everybody thinks it's a great idea, then it should be difficult to change. So, yeah, the Constitution was never meant to be a living document that just got reinterpreted year after year based on changing societal conditions. It was changing societal conditions that were meant to allow people to exercise the process to change the actual wording of the Constitution. Okay.
Okay, here's my photo. So we covered the Bill of Rights here. The First Amendment protects freedom of speech. The Fourth Amendment, freedom from unreasonable search and seizure. The Bill of Rights was designed as a restraint on the government from infringing on the liberty of citizens. We don't have protection for private actors like our employer can punish us for speech or even search our belongings on their property as a condition of employment. What about when private companies work as an agent of the government, such as Facebook, limited speech at the direction of the current administration?
So Don always provides a fun question for me at these. Okay, so the question was, and I'm going to paraphrase you here, the Bill of Rights in particular provides several protections from overreaching government. It's silent on overreaches from private entities, such as an employer requiring a vaccine, for instance. But what about, it's silent on what private enterprise might do. There's criminal law that governs that type of thing, including employment law. But what about when a private entity or person is acting as a quasi-governmental entity or an extension of government? And he used Facebook as an example. So if you haven't heard about this recently, Mark Zuckerberg finally came out and acknowledged that Facebook, Meta, was under direct duress and pressure from the federal government, and essentially orders from the federal government to censor information about COVID, about the pandemic, and election stuff and all sorts of other things. It was the federal government under the Biden administration that basically twisted Facebook's arm to suppress information that it didn't want to get out there, which is a direct violation of the freedom of speech under the First Amendment. But that was Facebook. That wasn't the federal government saying, thou shalt not say, true things about COVID. Thou shalt not question the integrity of the 2020 election. It wasn't the federal government directly doing that, but it was forcing Facebook to take and we all knew it at the time, it just took 4 years for Zuckerberg to admit it. So in that situation where the private enterprise is acting basically as an extension of the federal government, the courts, at least enough of them, have held that the pressure exerted on that private enterprise or private individual constitutes government action. So distancing yourself from the First Amendment by 1 or 2 degrees is not a protection. And that is a violation of the First Amendment. And even without the courts weighing in, any reasonable person can see this is the case. Want to hark back to the Soviet Union again. By the way, my wife was born in the Soviet Union. She grew up there before the wall fell. And if you've ever studied what happened during the Soviet Union, especially under Stalin, it was really bad under Stalin. The state, the Soviet Union, the government itself, would apply inordinate pressure to private citizens who would be punished or killed or imprisoned if they didn't do the bidding of the state in executing, literally and figuratively, or I should say literally with both definitions, what that part of the state was after. So they would come after Don, for instance, and say, we need you to spy on Brandon over here, and we need you to accuse him of a crime. If you don't accuse, he didn't commit it, we don't care. If you don't accuse him of the crime, we're going to throw you in prison and kill your family. So if Don goes ahead under that threat and said, all right, Brandon ran a red light in Oklahoma last month, send him to the gulag. Who's committing the violation? Is it Don? Because I'm threatening him, I as the Soviet Union, as the state, I'm threatening him with real severe consequences if he doesn't do what I say. So is Don the bad actor here? Or am I, as the state? Who bears real responsibility for that? So that goes back to his question about when the federal government is imposing consequences or threatening consequences on a private enterprise like Facebook for not doing what it wants. Like, there's no law attached to that. It's not you must obey the law. It's just do what I want or we're gonna sick the IRS on you. That is a violation of the First Amendment because any reasonable person can see that the federal government is initiating that action. It is initiating the censorship and the suppression of information. That is a direct violation of the First Amendment. Yes, ma'am.
Is there anything being done in regards to that particular situation? Like, yeah, like any charges or?
Not yet. Nothing real yet. Yeah. People are at least aware, which is a better situation than we had a few months ago. The reality is that people don't do anything unless they're sufficiently motivated. Doubly so when applied to people collectively. Like, if I'm really hungry, then I'll get up off the couch and go make a sandwich. But collective action that is really needed to address something like that, there's got to be powerful motivation. Enough people have to care enough to make anything actually happen. So I'm gonna use an example. I'll take one more question before we end, but an example back in 2021. This isn't actually about January 6th or the election. This is about Snowmageddon, Winter Storm Uri, when we came that close to losing the entire Texas grid, and they said it would have been offline for months. In a state the size of Texas, if we lose electricity statewide, nobody knows how to do anything the old-fashioned way anymore. How many people have a kerosene lamp at home? Oh, okay, more than I expected. Good for you. If we lost power statewide, FEMA ain't coming to our rescue. They'll be able to fiddle around our borders and help some people. Can you imagine what Austin would be like? 1 million miles removed from any ability, any supply chain that is all dependent on electricity. We were that close to losing it. This is a pretty dire situation, right? I remember that week very well. I'm sure most of us do. I was running around Plano trying to find whatever supplies I could to take them to the shelters. We had lots of parts of the city without electricity. We had a lot of people without water because either pipes had frozen or worse, burst. It was a disaster. So it was really real. A lot of folks were suffering. A lot of people died. We had a legislative session that year in Austin. Some of us have been championing strengthening our electric grid for a long time. And in fact, Senator Bob Hall was foremost among them. And I wrote at the time on Facebook, I said, if you're gonna make a list of people to blame for this catastrophe, put Bob Hall dead last. Because he was sounding the alarm on this and other issues regarding our energy security for a long time. But people just experienced it. It was really real. It was devastating for a lot of people. And there was a lot of noise made in the legislature. Nothing meaningful wound up happening. Some ERCOT board members were shuffled around. A few half measures were taken to help promote energy security, reliability. Nothing meaningful was done. Even though it just happened. It wasn't enough to wake enough people up. If the grid had gone down and we lost it for months, then they'd be awake, but it wouldn't matter anymore. And it was the following summer, and this was funny. Again, Councilwoman Maria too. This was in June when we were having rolling blackouts and power outages, and our our Encore representative was brought into the hot seat, literally, in front of City Council to explain what just happened in Plano because people were without power for days. And Maria said, last year during the winter storm, it was a record freeze. I understand why you weren't prepared, I get it, but were you really not prepared for heat in Texas in the summer? That was a mic drop moment. But it was more than a year later, and the problem was still occurring. We hadn't done anything meaningful. So to your question, enough people have to care enough. It has to be painful enough for enough people for anything real to happen. Right now, people are having meetings, people are having discussions about what the Biden administration did with Facebook and everything. And at least there's awareness now that didn't exist before, but that's only because Zuckerberg came out and said, yeah, it was true. Like what all the conspiracy theorists were saying, yeah, it was true all along. And I saw a meme a little while back, which was great. It said, we need to stop calling them conspiracy theories and start calling them spoiler alerts. Yeah, but enough people have to care enough. I'll take one more question. No more questions? Okay, we got a question. Yes, sir. Go ahead. Okay, so his question is about the Electoral College. There are several movements to abolish the Electoral College. And, this picked up in 2000 because George Bush won the Electoral College vote, but not the popular vote. President Trump won the Electoral College vote, but not the popular vote. And so there are people who are saying, well, we need to abolish the Electoral College because the will of the people isn't being heard, or whatever their rationale is. And it's very similar to the sentiment that led to the passage of the 17th Amendment. We want to vote on the senators. Our voice isn't able to be heard. We can vote on our congressmen and our state legislators. Why can't we vote on our U.S. senators? It's the exact same sentiment. Now, I hope we don't pass an amendment to abolish the Electoral College because it serves a critical purpose, just as did the appointment of U.S. senators by state legislators. And when that was subverted via the 17th Amendment, the entire balance of the states versus the federal governments was obliterated overnight on ratification. And it's a different mechanism with a different purpose, the Electoral College, but it would have the same consequences. It would subvert the relationship between the states and the federal government, and in this case, not just the federal government, but to the commander-in-chief, the highest office in the land. And the balance that exists, I should say what remaining balance exists between the states and the federal government, would effectively be completely wiped out. So, thank you all very much for sharing your time with me tonight. I appreciate it very much.
Just don't forget to stop by our tables, and also if you've moved your address and haven't registered to vote at your new address, Bri is a registrar. She can get you registered tonight. So make sure that you get registered to vote no later than October 5th to vote in the election in November. So go stop by the tables. Don't forget your free book on the way out. God bless you guys. Thanks for coming. Good night.